Good evening, and welcome to the second of 3 panel discussions in the Black Reflections series. My name is Stephen Banks, and I will be the moderator for tonight's conversation. Before I introduce myself and my fellow panelists, I want to share a little bit about this discussion series. Black Reflections was created directly in response to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis this summer. The protest movement that followed has pushed us all to consider the role of race in every part of society, including music. Each discussion in the Black Reflections series focuses on a different aspect of Black artistry and music, the contributions of Black artists, the experiences of Black artists, and what a just future for Black artists in classical music could look like. Tonight's discussion will focus on the experiences of Black artists. This panel includes a mix of Black orchestral musicians, composers, soloists, and professors, all with their own unique stories to tell. We will talk about our successes, setbacks, and our hopes for a more just future for Black musicians. On that note, I'd like to introduce myself formally. I'm Stephen Banks. I am a saxophonist and a composer, and I am also the professor of saxophone at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. I also am a member of the Nkeiru Saxophone Quartet. So I'd like to open the floor now to our panelist, Joseph Conyers.
Hi, I am Joseph Conyers. I am the assistant principal double bass of the Philadelphia Orchestra. I'm the executive director of an organization here in Philadelphia called Project 440, which serves youth through music. And I am the music director of the All City Orchestra here in Philadelphia, which serves the top performing students of the School District of Philadelphia. And I serve on the faculties of the Juilliard School and the Boyer College of Music at Temple University.
Thanks so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to get to chat with you today. Next, I'd like to introduce Nkeiru Okoye.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. And my name is Nkeiru Okoye, and I am a composer. And what I actually do is I do some musical storytelling. I do some research. I incorporate social sciences into the works that I do. But what I like best about what I'm doing as a composer is that I get people who don't think that they like classical music. I get them into the concert hall. So that's what I do.
Fantastic, very important work. And last but not least, our final panelist is Pilot.
Hi, my name is Hobson Pilot. I'm a graduate of Girls High in Philly and also the Cleveland Institute of Music. I was 3 years with the Washington National Symphony from 1966 to 69, and then 40 years with the Boston Symphony until my retirement in 2009.
Thank you so much for being here. All right, so let's get into our discussion here. So this question is for all of us, but I'd like to start with you, Anne, and it is, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience growing up and in music school. Did you come from a musical family? What was your relationship to music as a young student and as you went through the conservatory?
Well, I started with the piano when I was 6 years old. My mother was a concert pianist, and she made my sister and myself study the piano, which I didn't really like very much. So when I was at Girls High in Philly, they had a very extensive music program there. And that's where I began the harp. And I loved the harp from the first day. And obviously I've been doing it ever since. What was the other question?
No, that's perfect. Joe, maybe you could go next.
Sure, and if everyone's wondering why I keep smiling when Ms. Pilot speaks, it's because I am in Philadelphia. I'm at Girls High all the time here in Philadelphia because I conduct the All City Orchestra, and rehearsals are still held on the stage of Girls High School. And this sounds a little, this might be, well, anyway, we'll have to talk, Ms. Pilot. It's an honor to be in this, to be in this forum with you. So I started in Savannah, Georgia. That is my hometown. I started on piano when I was 5, so not unlike Ms. Pilot starting on piano. I came from a musical family, but it wasn't of any kind of professional. There weren't professionals in the family. My mom simply fell in love with classical music, became an amateur singer, and vowed that her 3 children would also play classical music. So we all started playing. I picked up the bass at the age of 11 because I got jealous of my brother and sister always going off to rehearsal, and I was there sitting there practicing by myself on the piano. So I picked up the double bass, and the rest is history. Yeah, that's as far as origins. Oh, I'd like to also mention that I grew up in the traditional African American Baptist church. So I grew up with a lot of gospel. I sang gospel growing up as a child and through high school. And it's still actually one of my favorite art forms. So
Fantastic. Nkeiru.
All right, well, I'm half Nigerian and half African American, and it impacts a lot of what happens next, because both of my parents they're educated people, but not in music. You know, my mother used to love music. In fact, she was a music major she was a music education major at Ithaca. And and she realized that wasn't for her, but we had a little organ in the house. And I grew up on Long Island, and, I'm sitting here and I'm looking at this instrument, and I would just go over and kind of stroke it. I was just one of those types of kids. And I would also make up these songs to lyrics, in children's books and whatnot. They would have a little poem, and it was supposed to be a song. So you think of Beatrix Potter books, and Peter Rabbit comes out and he sings his morning song, and there's the text. Well, there's no music. So of course, I'm just making up the music. And I had no idea what the ramifications of that meant. And I think that if I had grown up in a musical family, they would have said, "Oh, she's writing music." But instead, I'm just kind of making up whatever it is. I'm just listening to all of these things. And I ended up playing the piano. And I got a piano teacher when I was about 8 or 9, and then we moved me to a professional teacher. We learned about the difference between that when I was about 13. And, everything happened really fast after that. Right after that, I got into one of these Saturday music programs and started really doing the music thing. And they told me I was not going to be a pianist. And it unleashed this music that was in my head. It's kind of like the X-Men. You see the mutants, and the mutants have this onset of their powers at around puberty because of something that happens. And that's sort of what happened with me. So I'm listening to this music, and I go back to my junior high school, and my band director was in Earth, Wind, and Fire and some of the other pop groups. And he realizes this kid's writing music. So he gives me notation lessons because I wanted to write down this last thing that I was going to do in music, since they had said I was not going to be in music. Well, I won first place in a national competition, and so I was a composer.
And there it is. I love that. I love that. Well, I feel a little bit of a connection to Joe, what you were talking about with growing up in the church. I also grew up Baptist. I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I remember, singing in the devotionals at the beginning of service, and really trying to take that into my career as a musician in all sorts of ways. That idea of needing to express something, something that's happened to you that week, something that's on your heart, and getting up on the stage, getting up in front of your church members, church family, and singing your song. It doesn't necessarily have to sound a certain way, but it's gotta express something. And so that is that was where it all started for me. I think as many saxophonists do, I actually started on clarinet and then went over to the saxophone, and went through school and all of that. And so, speaking of getting into the conservatory or getting into the university side of things, I wonder if you could all reflect a little bit on your experiences at the collegiate level and maybe at the graduate level as well. I know that this is where many minority musicians, specifically Black musicians, start seeing some of the prejudices that might sort of rear their heads in this world of higher education. So I'd love to hear some about your specific experiences as Black artists in the conservatory, and whoever'd like to go first can feel free to just go ahead.
I can start. When I graduated from Girls High, I first went to the Philadelphia Musical Academy for 2.5 years, which was a very friendly place for me. There were quite a few Black musicians there. And so I had no problems at all. But after 2.5 years, I decided, and basically it was decided for me, that I needed to transfer to the Cleveland Institute of Music because the harp teacher there, Alice Shalafu, was really top of the line and the best. So a mentor of mine, Edna Phillips Rosenbaum, who was on the board of the Philadelphia Foundation, arranged for me to get a full tuition scholarship to Cleveland. So I moved out to Cleveland. My parents drove me there. I was going to be staying in the Case Western dorm because that's where the music students stayed. So I moved into my room in the dorm. I met my roommate, and my parents took me for dinner. When I got back to my dorm room, my roommate had moved out. And she told the house mother that she refused to room with a Black person. This was particularly surprising to me because she was also a pianist at the Institute. She was not just a Case Western student. So that was my shocking first experience with racism, shall we say, at the Cleveland Institute of Music. It was very upsetting, obviously, and all the kids in the dorm heard about it. And I think I may have been the only Black student in the dorm. So it was particularly newsworthy. And then after that, because there were quite a few harpists at the Cleveland Institute of Music because she was such a great teacher. I think there were 12 students, but of course I was the only, not of course, but I was the only Black student. And so there were some difficulties there with that. And there were not a lot of Black students back then at the Cleveland Institute of Music in any field. There were a few singers, and I think there was a clarinetist, but certainly not a lot of Black students.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how overt, racism has been throughout the past. And, as we move forward throughout history, sometimes those things are still overt and sometimes they become more systematic. So I'm wondering if any of our other panelists, have any similar experiences or ways that might have been even more subtle than that.
Subtle?
If you wanted to say that.
All right, well, I'm going to put a disclaimer before I make my, before I continue. I am a very, very proud Oberlin Conservatory alum. And while I was at Oberlin, I learned a lot of lessons. It was my first really formal music education, and that's what I got while I was there. I learned about different composers and styles so that I can write in many, many, many styles. And I would not be the composer that I am today had I not picked Oberlin. However, being there from, I would say, even my first day of class taught me about racism and sexism in a way that was intended to break my spirit. And when I use the word intentional, it has a certain connotation. Being the only woman or the only African American in a class is something that makes you feel isolated. And as I think it was Stephen who said that a lot of African American students feel that isolation, and they feel that it's not necessarily a welcoming or affirming environment. My freshman year, there were 900 students in the conservatory, and of those, there were 25 who were African American, including those that passed for white. And, you know, in that context, a lot of times you do get singled out. I certainly got singled out, but a lot of that wasn't necessarily intentional. It wasn't intended. A lot of people are not, especially in the conservatories, they're not acclimated to having Black people around. So there is sort of this newness about it, and that doesn't make it right. It doesn't excuse it. It kind of contextualizes that racism. But in my case, there were 4 white professors who were in charge of the composition department, and they made a point of letting me know that I was unwelcome. They belittled my writing. They expressed concern about my not liking the Western male-dominated music that they kept setting in front of me. And as an adult, knowing the rest of the story, or at least more of it, I can understand that the faculty had a hard time visualizing a career in composition for me because they were not aware of any precedents for me. They didn't see that their canon and their racism and their sexism would just not allow that vision to happen. But fortunately, I had 2 things going for me besides the raw talent that got me in there. And just when I got into Oberlin, I had not had a single composition lesson. I had simply learned music theory and some form well enough to get in there. And with that type of student, you'd think you'd want to nurture that talent. And that's just, they just decided that wasn't going to happen. But again, you know, my sophomore year, I ended up meeting a Black composer, and he decided to mentor me. And seeing him gave me enough hope to finish my degree there and to accept the lessons for the good and for what it was worth. And then second, I have self-determination, and that's sometimes defiance. And when these men decided to devalue me, it galvanized me. And so it wasn't about proving them wrong. I just wanted to stick it out because they said it wasn't going to happen. And so I found myself in studying about Black composers and African-American history, and it's an interdisciplinary approach that would not have happened without the conservatory and the ability to take Black studies classes at the college.
Wow. And I think that's an excellent story about the importance of representation. You were saying that you found a Black composer. I'm curious who that was.
Oh, his name was Noel DaCosta. And he lived in New York, and he lived around the corner from my mother's stepmother. And they said, "Oh, you're doing composition. You must meet this composer." That was it.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. Sometimes it just takes the having a little bit of a feeling that you belong in that space.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I learned of Joseph Boulon. I immediately, I remember just weeping the first time I heard his music, and seeing his picture. There was such a connection there that was really, really great for me. Joe, I wonder if you have anything to add.
Sure. So there's so many, I guess, levels and shades to all of this, but my upbringing, I said, was very much in the church, but I also, and the church was definitely, it was, again, a Black Baptist church. But then my schooling, I was able to go to a private school with my siblings, which was predominantly white. That said, my very first piano teacher, very first music person, was a woman, or is a woman, named Rose Smith. And she is African American. And that's when I was 5 years old. So for me, I always had a very, I would say, a diverse approach, whether it was going to the piano lessons and then or bass lessons and then church and then school. That said, we were also held pretty tight at home. And what I mean by that is there was not a lot of going out. So it was like me doing my own thing or us doing our own thing in the Conyers family. And so I, while growing up, I didn't feel at the time. It's so funny. You're in hindsight, I can look back at some things and go like, that's interesting. But I mean, again, I had a supportive minister who basically said we could do whatever we wanted and had an orchestra, and so I had that mindset. And so if someone had an issue, I hardly ever saw it because I always saw it as a personal problem for them, and I was going to keep trudging forward. I studied at the Curtis Institute of Music. For me, having left Savannah, it was one of the most diverse places I'd ever seen because there were so many students from all around the world, which I thought was super exciting. Even then, I was very much on the straight and narrow, and what I mean, I was in the practice room a lot. So the things that affected me the most are actually things I remember that actually were not necessarily part of the music experience, to be honest. It was actually, for example, one of the summer festivals I went to, there was a bus driver who would drive the students around. And there was an incident where he wouldn't allow me to bring the bass, because we had to carry the bass onto the front part of the bus. And that's the way I was always used to doing it. I mean, this is kind of a small story, but at the same time, it was a big deal because ultimately, long story short, I had to go on through the back, which was a much more difficult process for me because I needed extra people. And apparently he said something that I did not hear that was incredibly derogatory towards me. And students reported it, and he never drove the bus again. But again, for me in my head, that was like, that was, I mean, I more felt sorry for him because I felt like I had something to offer musically or offer to the world. And it was hard to let that actually chip away at my potential. And I mean, if anything, I guess as an African-American player, particularly in this profession, I don't know if it's not like you, there's so many, again, you got my brain going in all these different directions because there's almost like this element of surprise, I think, that particularly if you show up and you play and people are like, and I think I got so used to that, like, that if anything, it actually made me smile because I was hoping that in that process, I was able to show that, yes, people who look like me can play at a high level, do have an understanding, can be leaders in this field. So while I didn't have any direct instances in music in that way, particularly in school, that's kind of the way I handled it. And if there were issues, I was just doing my own thing. I almost felt like it was their loss that I couldn't connect with them on the same musical level that we were all hoping to connect with each other, particularly at that level. So,
yeah, I really admire your ability to come at it from that perspective, especially at such a young age. Because I think for a lot of people, if they don't have that sense of community from the Black community, if they don't grow up in that, then it can be hard to sort of have that feeling of self-worth going through that. I remember for myself, I went to Indiana and Northwestern, and coming from North Carolina, that was quite a culture shock, I guess you would say, and just sort of it didn't necessarily hit me over the head, but I think it maybe wore on me over time that a lot of the things that I grew up with and experienced in the South, for example, just like going to the barbershop, the idea that the church or the barbershop or whatever is sort of a central part of the community, and that's where you can go and talk about things that are going on with you, whether it's in school or in the community. And showing up at a conservatory where there is no Black community whether you know, whether you feel really confident in yourself or not can be really difficult. Yeah, Joe, please.
No, I just wanted to jump in. It's because when I was in high school, I was in high school in the late 90s. When I was in high school, that was the beginning of, it's because I love how you mentioned these communities. I felt like I did have these communities, even if they were siloed in my head, but they were all these different communities. So as far as Black performers, I got involved with the Sphinx organization from its very first year. In 1998 was the very first Sphinx competition, and I was a semifinalist in that, and met some dear friends who are friends with me to this day. And I almost feel like that, again, and some of them ended up coming to Curtis, which was neat. But from that, I had a Black musical family in classical, even though they may not have been with me all the time. But I did have that experience, and I'm thankful to an organization like Sphinx for providing that, because that was probably, it was one of the most, probably one of the most influential moments in my life, where for my whole life, I was one of the only with my siblings. And then to be in the space where there are other Black people who listen to gospel music, or I remember being in the car. I mean, and I don't even listen to rap personally. That's just me. But we were in a car and everyone was listening to rap, and I just loved it, because it was great to have that spirit and that camaraderie in that way. So I did have that connection through Sphinx.
Yeah. And I'd love to throw another question your way. I'm wondering, we have on this panel fantastic orchestral musicians, and you are one of those, having spent a lot of time in the Boston Symphony. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about your experiences, maybe doing auditions, or your time in either of the orchestras that you spent so much of your life serving and being a part of. Did you have experiences where you felt excluded for being Black, or times where your race played a big role in how you were able to take in that experience that you had?
Well, my first job, as I said, was with the Washington National Symphony from 1966 to 69. And I was offered that job because their harpist had a serious injury to her hand and was not able to play. So they gave me a contract for a year, and then they liked my playing, so they asked me to continue. So actually the only audition I ever took was the one for Boston. And at that time, they had just started the screen process, where you audition behind a screen, which was very interesting. Earl Madison and Art Davis had auditioned for the New York Philharmonic with Leonard Bernstein recently, or just before that, and had sued the New York Philharmonic when they didn't get the jobs. So when I auditioned for Boston shortly after that, there were several phone calls from different publications like the New York Times or Time Magazine, asking me and asking the BSO if I thought that I got the job because I was Black. In other words, because of the lawsuit, they thought that Boston might have been afraid not to hire me. And fortunately, the personnel manager gave a statement to them saying, we wanted the best player we could find, and that's what we did. So, but I mean, most of the incidents that I incurred, the racial problems that I incurred, came from some of the players and making strange statements. I mean, when I joined the orchestra, there were only 4 or 5 women in the orchestra, and no Blacks at all. So I had a double whammy to deal with. And I did a TED Talk recently where I tell the story of my first day with the BSO. I don't know if you heard that, where I went to my first rehearsal and was tuning my harp and warming up, and this man came running over to me And I thought he was going to say something like, "Welcome to the orchestra, it's nice to have you," something polite. But instead he looked at me and he said, "You must fry some mean chicken." I mean, I was absolutely stunned. I had to laugh. I mean, it's really funny. And I couldn't believe he said it. I think I must have asked him two or three times, what did you say? And finally, I realized he was trying to communicate with me, and that was the only way that he knew, was fried chicken. So finally I said to him, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." But so there were a lot of, I guess you would call them ignorant statements like that, because Boston was, at that time, that was, as I said, 1969. And Boston was having a lot of incidents with busing and all of that. But for the most part, I felt that the orchestra, the management, the conductors were very fair with me. So I didn't have problems there.
Yeah. And as a follow-up to that, how did you handle those experiences, you know, back then? I guess publicly, but also how did that feel? And for young musicians coming through the profession today, how would you advise them to handle situations like that?
Well, it depends on the situation. I mean, the chicken story, as I call it. The first time I ever told that story in public was for that TED Talk. Now, that happened in 1969, and the TED Talk happened a couple of months ago, in 2020. So I've told, obviously, my husband and my family and close friends, but I never told that story in public. Why it was, I mean, it's kind of, and I think it's funny. I think it's funny that a person would do that. I mean, what can you do but laugh at that? However, there were times when what someone said was not funny. For example, someone used the N-word. It was after Ollie Wilson, an African-American composer, had a piece played by the BSO, and his piece was first on the program. And I didn't play that piece, I played the next piece. So at intermission, I was leaving the hall to go home. I had my coat on, and one of the members of the BSO, who was standing in front of a group of orchestra wives, he turned to me and said, "Why do the N-words always leave early?" Now, see, that's not funny. That was not funny at all. And I knew why he was saying it. He was showing off to these women. So I just looked at, I kind of glared at him and walked away. But the next day when I saw him at rehearsal, I said to him, "Don't you ever use that word in front of me again." And he was, "Oh, well, I didn't mean anything by it. Richard Pryor uses it all the time," was his excuse. So, I mean, I really had it out with him, and he never did use it again, and he did apologize for it. If he had not apologized or had not, had continued to use it, I would have reported him to the management. So I think you have to pick your battles,
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm really inspired by all three of your abilities to bring strength and resilience to all of these situations that have come your way, and I'm sure that has enhanced your sense of artistry at every step. And I wanted to ask all three of you, sort of looking forward. Maybe we'll start with you, Nkeiru. If there was one thing that you could change about the field of classical music to make it more diverse, equitable, and just or inclusive, what would it be?
Well, I spent a lot of time really thinking about this particular question, especially now as people are talking so much about, they're having webinars like this one, and people are coming to me, and my white colleagues are coming and saying, hey, we need to be more diverse. How do we do this? And it's, they're kind of laying this at my feet. And it causes a bit of burnout, but when you get over the burnout, you start thinking about, okay, let's see about this. And what I would do, and what I advise I do some consulting with clients about this. I would let people know, especially the white people who are, if they're in charge of running arts institutions, I want them to know that it's their perspectives of what Blackness is, but it's not necessarily reality. And their judgment and their assessment, when they understand that their judgment and their assessment is based on inherent biases, and it's not necessarily intentional, but this is the way this country was formed. But if you can understand that, and that because of that bias, it necessarily causes them to associate Black people as being underprivileged, as underclass, as undereducated. The problem starts there, because until you're able to see this person as your equal and able to envision that there are, obviously some of us are going to be poor, there are others of us who are extremely wealthy, and there's the whole gamut in between. And I see a lot of arts organizations, and they intend well. And what they do is they say, okay, we're going to go into the inner city and we're going to change them through concert music. Well, what about going to and there's nothing wrong. In fact, there's everything good about those intentions. But what about looking at the Black middle class? What about understanding that there is a Black middle class, and that if you reach out to them and you invite them in and treat them as equals, they're more likely to come to your concerts, which will have its own effect. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, fantastic. Joe, I'll pass it to you. I think you're muted there.
Thank you. Yes, I have a few thoughts, and one is for young Black musicians who might be coming into the field. One is honor those who came before you. Honor those who came before you. I mean, hearing the story of Hobson Pilot, some of my African-American colleagues in the Philadelphia Orchestra, I think one reason it's easier for me to put it behind me is because I know many things that they went through is far worse than I am going through. So in a way, and to honor them and all that, the sacrifices that have been made over centuries, I have to move forward, and I have to continue to be the best that I can be. And along those lines, next is with youth, and I work with a lot of young people. Really letting, in the orchestra industry, I think one of the things that could be better is looking at every child as potential to be on that stage. And I know it sounds pretty easy and like, oh, of course, that's what we do. I don't think that's actually what's going on. It's, you can, and to that end, and that goes to my third thing, don't do things that are totemic in nature, or like, oh, well, we gave our one, we do the MLK concert. Of course, we honor, and we do a piece for Black History Month, and we have a Black singer, which is kind of the way it's always been. And, but that's, so to connect all these different pieces together, it's, when working with young people, let them know that they can achieve, and don't dismiss their own background or make them dismiss their own background to be part of that process. And I would like to charge that to the orchestras for the concert hall. Don't make people dismiss who they are to be part of this thing, because this thing does not belong to you. Music belongs to no one. It's everyone. And I'm excited the fact that I am from the South. I mean, again, this is where I get proud. I grew up in a Baptist church. And just like you said at the beginning, Stephen, I bring my authentic self, because in gospel music, it's not about playing perfectly, it's about expressing. And when I think about all the different aspects of different cultures and what they can bring to classical music, it doesn't belong, it's not, it's music. And we can all participate and make the experience more enriching for everyone. So I hope that made sense, but it was those three little things that I thought about that would make for a bright future for what we do in this industry.
Yeah, yeah. Anne.
Well, I know that I would never have had the career I've had or even found the harp if it were not for Girls High, where they had this wonderful program. And it's very disappointing that there's not a lot of music in the schools anymore. And I mean, everybody knows that in order to win one of these jobs, you basically have to start young. I mean, I started when I was 14 and just was fortunate to be dedicated to it so that I moved more quickly. But it's much better, especially as a string player, if you're much younger than that. So these programs that exist now, like Sphinx, like Project STEP in Boston, are wonderful. But if they could have music in the public schools like they used to, it would open up the ability for a lot more kids to be introduced to music at a younger age. So that would be my wish for the future of young people in classical music.
Great. And one thing I've been reflecting on recently as a teacher is that I would really like to see a future in which the teaching of music in general is in some way decentralizes classical music and comes at teaching students from a perspective of like natural music making through in whatever culture it is. So I've culture or part of the world or whatever you want to call it. I've been experimenting with my students and trying to give them more autonomy to write some of their own music, or to practice improvising, or to think about the art of transcription in terms of not only, but just like listening to things and trying to recreate what they're hearing. A lot of times we associate transcription with jazz, but we can also associate transcription with listening to a fantastic opera singer and trying to recreate that vibrato, you know, on whatever instrument you're playing. So I think that we can form a much more inclusive environment in the music industry as a whole if we don't hold different types of different genres in such high esteem, and we're all thinking about how we can be musicians in the whole sense. You know, if we're looking back at J.S. Bach, you know, he was an improviser, composer, performer, all of these things, and I think there's a lot of power in that. So our final question here, many of us have sort of touched on this just a little bit, is about advice for young Black musicians that are living through this time in America. And we do have to get to our question and answers from our audience that's in the webinar here, but I maybe want to give one of you a chance to answer that question and speak directly to our Black youth and how this time might affect their steps forward.
Don't everybody speak at once.
I already touched on it a little bit, so I was trying to keep my mouth shut. Yeah.
Sure. Oh, go ahead,
Yeah,
Anne.
I did a Zoom meeting with some young African Americans, very young African American students from New Jersey, I believe it was. And by very young, I mean, I think that I wasn't sure if they were like still elementary school or middle school. And several of the questions were like, what advice do you have for me? Because I would love to be a harpist, but I'm African American. And so what I kept trying to point out to them is, you know, don't look at it like that. I mean, she and the guy that said this was sounding like being African American makes it so that they would never be successful. So I said to them, imagine if back in whatever it was that I started the harp, if I had that mindset. Well, I can't do this because I'm African American. Well, you just have to practice, and develop your skills to the best that you can. And don't think of being African American as a drawback, because as I think it was Joe that said, it can increase your ability to play music with passion and with feeling. As an African American, we certainly have all kinds of experience in jazz and other things. So that's what I would say. Just continue to develop yourself artistically the best that you can.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so some of our questions from our other participants here in the webinar. Charlie asks, what are some ways that you can celebrate diversity, particularly as a teacher and conductor? For anyone that might want to jump in there first.
Please go.
For whoever it is who asked that, there is, when you're working especially with kids, it's so important for them to know that there's a precedence for them. And there is the Rachel Barton Pine Foundation coloring book of Black composers. It's biographical, so it gives you the stories of about, it's 40 composers. I happen to be one of the composers, but it's just, and also so is my teacher. But it's an amazing resource, and it's very self-fulfilling. So I would start there, and also look into music by Black composers, find out who we are and assign it and give it to people and teach it.
Awesome, thank you. And actually another question for you, Nkeiru, from Shirley. She asks, as you were being discouraged by your instructors, did you draw inspiration from any Black composers in other genres?
Well, I answered the question, but I will. I had always had a little bit of jazz, a little bit of gospel, and a little bit of pop music. And it was kind of this collage of influences that my music had in there. And that's what got me into the conservatory. And, you know, this was my music, and it wasn't something that we listened to all the time. But then I went back and I made a point of learning music and researching music by Black composers. And what I really wanted to know was, how were they able to maintain something of our culture? And I saw that they were studying poems by Black poets, or some people would put in a spiritual, and they would have the spiritual as some folk music, just as an idiom that's in there. And they would always, they would find a way to deliberately superimpose that in there, or perhaps I shouldn't say deliberately, but perhaps it was just inherent. And seeing other people do that helped me to develop my own style. So That's my answer.
Great. Thank you. This next question is for anyone. Do you believe there is anything that the classical genre should do to systemically support Black musicians? I think I put some of those words out of order. Let me try one more time. Do you believe there is anything the classical genre should do systemically to support Black musicians? Maybe changes the meaning just a little bit.
I would say play music by Black musicians. That's how to do it. It's that simple. I don't know why it's almost like this trying to figure out what the nuclear codes are. This is very simple work. If we want to have more diversity in the field, play music that's more diverse. I mean, I was going to go to the conductor question and say, like, I have to educate myself, because the canon of training that I received didn't include a lot of Black composers, and I am actively doing this work on my own so I can inform my students and everyone else that I work with, and even the orchestra, and try to introduce them to these great pieces that have almost been just lost and forgotten about, simply because these composers were African or Black. I mean, some of them are from Europe. So I think orchestras need to between music directors and artistic directors, do your research, listen and invite, and don't make it strange. It's not like an event. Ooh, we're doing it. Like, just program it. Like, make it happen. This is something that's really easy. And I know we're coming up close on time. I wanted to let Ms. Pilot know that the Philadelphia Orchestra just hired its first African-American woman in the orchestra. I don't know if you heard about this.
No, I didn't.
You did not. Our principal librarian is Nicole Jordan, who is also a graduate of Girls High. So I thought you might find that to be very interesting. Girls High is doing some stuff over there. So she just started with us this season.
Fantastic.
That's great. We have, I believe, one more question. And this is for anyone. It's from Kelsey. Looks like she's a fan of Miss Pilot as well. She says, how can we as students push for change in our conservatory educations to encompass Black artists? She says, also, I am a harpist and am so inspired by you, Miss Pilot. So anyone that wants to jump in on that. I could jump in a little bit on that as well. I think it's very difficult to push for change, but I think that it is always the most meaningful when it comes from the students themselves, because teachers, as Joe was sort of just alluding to, many teachers know what they know, and they've been teaching that for 30, 40 years. And the act of changing a curriculum or learning a new body of repertoire for their rotation that they do every 4 years, if they're at an undergraduate institution, is a really big deal. You know, it takes a lot of time to be able to develop the amount of mastery that you need to teach students. So when I was a graduate student at Northwestern, I started this petition, and I was trying to do all these things to get at the time it was to change our music theory and oral skills curriculum to make it more diverse. And by that, I sort of meant anything at all, like maybe put some examples in the course packet. You know, you can do solfege or whatever you want to do with Joseph Billon or Samuel Covers Taylor, who whatever. It doesn't really have to be Haydn necessarily. And even things that were as simple as that needed a petition in which, you know, 85% of the student body, you know, signed it, and, you know, engaged in alumni and all that. So it's difficult. And so I would say that if you want the change, you have to be willing to speak up for it, speak to your leaders, your deans, your provosts, perhaps even. And you have to also realize that you may not only be advocating for that change for yourself, because if you're, a junior or a second year master's student at the time, that change is not going to happen in a month. I wish it could. And I'm saying this as a teacher that really wants to see change, and someone that is trying to advocate for it in my own institution. You have to start these conversations and fight the good fight for not only yourself and your colleagues, but also the next generation and the people that you may even be teaching, so that by the time we're maybe 25 years down the road, 20 years down the road, that this is normalized, and then we don't have to all be signing petitions and having conversations every other day on this, but that it's a part of the fabric of what we've all already learned. So that's just what I might add for that question.
Could I
Sure.
agree and disagree with you at the same time?
Sure, please.
I agree that the students need to get involved, and it's the students' passions, wanting to know more about that repertoire. But I want to point out that over the years, 20 years ago, there was passion about, we wanted to learn about Black composers. They're still not being taught. 40 years ago was probably the same thing, and they were students and petitions, and I'm just going to encourage all of these places. I think that there needs to be a partnership also listening to Black alum and listening to our stories. And I think that one thing that I've seen just by listening to stories of people who have gone through the conservatory experience is vastly different for white people and for Black people. And I think that if schools of music sent out, if they polled their Black alum and said, hey, how many of you stayed in music? How much racism did you see? What can we do to help this generation? I think that we'd see more change because there's just statistical information that's out there. So anyway, but I think there needs to be both. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. That's a great idea, polling alumni. I love that. Well, I think that's our final question. And so I would like to thank all of our esteemed panelists here, and Hobson Pilot, Joseph Conyers, and Nkeiru Okoye, for joining me here today and educating me and educating our audience here. I think this was a really fruitful discussion, and I'm really honored to have been able to connect with you all, and I hope to work with you at some point in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you.